Okay, so this is the series in which Lita, Cosmides, and I are speaking, and this is a title that the talk doesn't quite match, but anyway, it's an important concept, underlying concept that we'll get to is that there is many ways in which the world could be mapped to shaping the mind, but we're looking at the thing which has cumulative effect are the things that recur over deep time. So selection pressure that goes this direction for a few generations and that direction for a few generations has very little cumulative effect. And it's subtle but deep invariances or regularities of the world are what have shaped our minds. Okay, so, but anyway, for those of you who want to sleep, here's the executive summary of the talk. You are a computer built by selection and melted or disordered by entropy. I am too, right? So, and this is really, I'm apparently the only one on Earth who thinks this is funny, but it encapsulates both my intellectual trajectory from the beginning. You know, I'm a person, and then, but wait, how does that exactly work? Maybe I'm a computer. I don't even know anymore, right? And, but also I would argue that that's sort of where we are in the history of the cognitive sciences. Like, we've disassembled our intuitive notion of being a person or an agent, and now we have the pieces around us on the floor, and maybe we will be able to reassemble things. Okay, so quick recap. There are many more ways of being disordered. For arrangements, there's many more ways of being disordered than ordered, provided, but that depends upon your frame of reference or how you're parsing the world. But first I'll say, just from a basic, I'll claim it without elaboration, that there are many more ways of being disordered than ordered. Desirable states, if you're targeting something, the target is much smaller than firing in any direction, and all hits count as being successful, right? So if you're making a cybernetic device, something designed to accomplish something, it's, depending on how high quality the system is, it's increasingly often state space of increasingly narrow designs to achieve increasingly narrow, highly desirable outcomes, right? So you get for free, or it's just part of the organizing structure of the universe, that because there are many more ways of being disordered than ordered, the operation of probability plus the passage of time will increasingly disorder things. Okay, so that's the simplest way you can put sort of the second law of thermodynamics, which is really much more general than thermodynamics. Thermodynamics is about energy concentration or dispersal. But that is one important foundational feature of the universe, right? So, however we look around, and while we see things like, you know, the lunar landscape and gas through interstellar space and so on, 99.9999% of the universe is pretty highly disordered, right? But then there's this exception, and it's exclusively life and the things that life creates, right? There's spectacular order there. And how is that even possible, right? If everything goes from whatever initial low probability accidental thing it got to towards the operation of time to increasingly go to more probable, less organized states, right? Well, life replicates, and it's important to just spend time, and not now, but thinking about this, right? What are all the steps that you would have to put a clump of atoms in, arrange a clump of atoms such that it can make copies of itself, right? It's an incredibly improbable set of arrangements that have that basic thing. And in fact, the origin of the first life form is a non-trivial problem. I don't have mystical opinions about it, but nonetheless, it's a big explanatory gap in our understanding of things. But given that sometime in the vast expanse of time, and we're talking about things that are now sets of molecules that are very small compared to the size of the ocean and so on. Somehow, over very long periods of time, with huge numbers of possible random events, there was the initial replicator, right? And just a quick throwaway line, which is nobody's in any doubt about, that the thermodynamic energy flow from more concentrated energy, or sun as an open system, or volcanic activity, to more dispersed energy, that's a flow that life forms tap into in order to fuel their operations, right? But then we have this very specific kind of physical order, replicative order, right? So life forms are ordered, but not with respect to any frame of reference, only with respect to replicative frames of reference. That is, they are ordered by virtue of having arrangements which increase the probability that the system will replicate, right? And it sounds almost like one's speaking tautologies, but it's not a tautology, that this tendency to self-execute replication by the laws of physics, the organization executes self-replication through the operation of physics, and fueled by thermodynamic flows. You get a special kind of physical order, replicative order, and these also break down under entropy, but crucially not before on surviving branches of life, not before the system is able to make even more copies of itself, which then themselves both make a sufficient number, make copies of themselves, and all of them then, of course, deteriorate under entropy. So it's a very cheery worldview, right? So replication is this escalator that propels those designs that are better endowed with the features oriented to increase the probability of replication upward in frequency, and those that are worse at it drop in frequency. And so this is a fountaining process by which one gets, this eventually fills the world, right? So an organism has descended organisms, and it's fueled by energy flows, but there's nothing violating of anything to make a copy of yourself, nothing that violates any sort of, even though it looks like it's sort of a violation of one's a first naive approach at entropy and disorder, it's not. So that the systems can make copies of themselves, so order can spread, right? So if you have many offspring and you yourself are ordered, and now you have many copies of that order out there. And also, this escalating process is taking the better designed in the offspring set, and it's more likely that those will be the ones that are themselves replicated at higher rates, right? So you have this extremely surprising thing in a world of physics where this one particular kind of order, replicative order, can increase without it violating any kind of principle. And it's not a foregone conclusion. If the environment changes too fast, or a supernova goes off nearby or something, then life is snuffed. And in fact, it's extremely grim, these gamma ray bursts that look as if they scrub very large regions of galaxies, especially earlier in the history of the universe, of all life, right? And so we're pretty lucky to be here, unless you regret life, in which case that it's terrible that you're here anyway. But okay. But also replicative order, we think of it inside the body envelope of the organism, but it actually exists in the relationship between the features, the design of the organism, and the properties of the organism's environment, right? Because it's interactions between the design and the environment which cause replication, cause development and then replication. So we can deduce from this that functional order is the only order to be found in organisms that explains their existence and their properties, right? And so moving ahead from this very broad view, Lida, in the last lecture, contrasted normative theories about how organisms, how humans ought to be acting, derived from statistics and logic and other formal theories. She argued that the appropriate source of normative theories, how we think systems should operate, will be relative to analyses that derive from replicative order in a structured task environment. So it's theories. We're actually looking not to do our cognitive science based on these things which played no role in our creation, but instead we're looking for these stranger theories that have to do with the replication in our specific ancestral task environments. And those are theories of adaptive function. Okay. And so Lida gave several examples of these hypothesized programs. And but these were evolutionarily rational computational designs, but they were designed to accept broad ranges of inputs rather. So frequencies of events and things like that. So they were not entirely content-free, so particularly the free rider and so on, but they were of a kind which we're already more designed to accept, or not more designed, we're more open to thinking about things which don't posit content in the mind, because that's considered to be very exotic. But so many behavioral scientists consider that another claim that we make, the idea that the evolved architecture of the mind should contain specialized systems which have content-like features, what philosophers would once have called innate ideas, perhaps. They consider that false and absurd, obviously absurd. I can't tell you the number of times I've been told that there can't possibly be anything so specific as the kinds of things we talk about in the human mind. And we don't even need to think about those things, right? But before we get to those absurd claims, I'm going to do a lightning round of quick points. So organisms are highly non-random with respect to function, but they're not perfect, whatever that would mean, or optimal, right? The objective floor against which one's measuring goodness of design is random with respect to function, because that's what physical processes throw together. There's no reason to think, except for the operation of natural selection, that things should be non-random with respect to function, and therefore the functions that we should look for are those that contribute to replication. And then another kind of argument one commonly hears, we hear all our life, is that, well, selection is a kind of good enough principle, and it's not really very good, and so you expect the human mind to be well, you might have some kind of functional properties, but they're really going to be crude, okay? And so I like things where you can see for yourself, right? And so these are, originally, these were all one common ancestral species, right? And they have an underlying body plan, and yet natural selection can work on them. And you can see that at any distance, these would be extraordinarily hard to recognize. And also, I must say that people talk about constraints on perfection, which we're not talking about, but constraints on how good design might be. And here, the organism has to have sort of all its ordinary functions and eating and so on, but here we're just seeing the effect of not being detected as something nutritious by avian and other predators, right? And so here you can see that despite constraints, whatever those might be, and all the other trade-offs of being a good organism replicating, here we can see that the intensity of predation is making these trade-offs pretty significant. And my favorite thing is, I don't know if you can ever get to the aquarium in Hawaii, but they have leafy sea dragons, and they have a display in which there's the kelp in which they're fish, right? As you can readily see, they're fish, right? And so the waves are breaking and the kelp is going like this. And so not only do they look like the kelp, but they undulate in just the same periodicity as the kelp. And that's really quite amazing. Okay, so good. That didn't take as much time as I thought. Okay. So another thing which is very sobering, since I like to be mean to undergraduates, and they talk a lot about how tough their lives are and how much they're triggered by anything that's slightly stressful, I talk about the things their ancestors did and faced. And one of the key things is their ancestors, the lucky ones, buried, many more than half their children, right? And then they got themselves up and they went ahead and they did the next step, right? And so if somebody says a cross word to them and this incapacitates them for the school year, right? I tell them that they're much stronger than that, but that's trivial. And they're designed, they have in them the evolved designs to be much tougher than that. And I also show them mammoths and cave bears, and I say, your ancestors hunted those guys with pointed sticks, right? And I have a line on the wall, which is how high some of these things are, right? And imagine going up to that and killing that. I mean, cooperatively with others, but still. Okay, so the sobering thing is that in any sexually reproducing species, the long-run evolutionary average of how many offspring survive to reproductive adulthood is a little more than 2. You can qualify that a little bit, but if it were much more than 2, then the universe would have filled up with that species. And if it were less than 2 over the evolutionary long run, that species would have disappeared. So given that it's here, it's there, and it's not, the biosphere isn't full of that species, the evolutionary long-term average is 2, okay? And and so there's the statistical role, and yet none of our direct ancestors has link by link by link, mother to mother to mother to mother, et cetera, father, all the way back to 3.8 billion years or whatever, has failed to reproduce. And that's going to the casino and having an extraordinary run of good luck, a mind-blowing run of good luck, right? But you flip that and what's really going on, right? So is that every generation, there are many, many organisms that are begun, and then only a few make it through. And these are not necessarily the absolute best designs, but they're from the upper range. Randomly, they're selected from a range which is towards higher quality than lower quality. So mutations are reigning in, and largely unfavorable mutations. And so the species can't persist unless those negative mutations are eliminated. And they're eliminated by this process of 2 plus or minus being sampled out of the total offspring set, right? And it's an extremely grim worldview, right? So no wonder we don't like to think about it. But anyway, it's the way it has been. And I just want to take an example which is very striking, which is there's a kind of fish called the sunfish, and it lays a nest with 150 million eggs, right? And yet, on average, a little more than 2 of those eggs will grow up to reproductive adulthood. So think about the potential information gain or the potential quality gain in 2 out of 150 million, right? So they're obviously very unlikely to be the absolute very best genotypes, but on the other hand, there's a lot of room there for, so you reproduce, entropy enters during the process of reproduction, and then these genetically contributed to deaths clean And this is not a moral thing, and this is not a lecture for eugenics, God help us, but it is just a fact that the replicative order is restored. So we roll down the hill, and then selection tosses back a few, way towards the top of the hill again, and then the next generation roll downhill, right? Okay, so, and that's a very extreme case. Leopards, 1 in 40 offspring, that's 2 in 40 offspring make it. Ancestral humans, it depends on how you count, from conception or from late term or whatever, but something on the rough order of 12 or 8 live births, estimates vary. And that's so our ability, the gradient that allows us to climb back up generation after generation is much smaller than for the sunfish or something like that, but still, here we are. Okay, so selection distills us cumulatively through repeated encounters with irregularities of deep time, right? So these as I said, something that's there for a little bit but then disappears is not going to have a huge cumulative impact on our design. So, and to push, so more or less a mutation is going to occur once, maybe a few times in a population, but then for it to become part of the species design, it has to be pushed uphill from a frequency of 1 in n, where n is the species size, and from 1 to n, it takes a minimum of n events in real world, ancestral selective events. So something happening in a particular time in a particular place, right? And it takes a long time for, if you have 1 million in the species, it takes a long time to climb from 1 to 1 million, right? So the same selection pressure must recur over and over again to make these n physical events happen, meaning that our designs evolved to reflect these really subtle, persistent regularities and not transient things. So our designs are distillations of deep time. And here, and also, I think we don't appreciate how subtle these regularities can be. So let me just take a quick example. Not everything is known about this example, but it seems the evidence weighs on this. But so if you could imagine humans are on high altitudes, and therefore to do things they need more oxygen because there's less atmospheric pressure, and therefore you could imagine that genes for bigger lungs are selected for Tibetans, and then people who live down on the coasts that they can afford to have smaller lungs, right? So they have selection for smaller lungs, right? And then what happens when people move back and forth, right? Well, it's clear that there is something quantitative genetic variation for things like that. But also, if you take somebody born from a large number of generations in high altitudes and you raise them at the seashore, their lungs are smaller, right? And why might that be? It might not be that there are genes for big lungs and genes for small lungs. Over evolutionary time, people move around, and so there will be competition between genetic ranges which are narrow and for where you are, a local thing. But there'll be a longer term selective competition for a rule something like the following, that as you develop, grow your lungs until the recharge rate of your bloodstream upon exertion occurs at a certain speed, right? So at high altitude, your lungs will naturally follow this developmental rule and grow bigger. At low altitudes, they will naturally grow smaller. And so the difference won't be genetic, it will be in this subtle regularity in the developmental program that evolved to match the range of variation that our ancestors encountered, right? And so I think a lot of things that seem different in this population, so this is a common observation among children of foreign service personnel. So they are, in various phenotypic traits, they're midway between their parents' traits, number of sweat glands per per square inch on the surface of the square centimeter on the surface of the body, that, you know, if you go to the Sudan, you have a lot of sweat glands per square centimeter if you are raised there, right? And then if you are raised in some other place that's not so hot, then your sweat glands will be fewer, right? So there's an underlying set of developmental processes which are looking for these subtle regularities, and that our developmental processes, I think, are largely in these subtle things which require a lot of effort and functional mindedness or adaptation mindedness to recognize and see. Okay, so, and for a complex adaptation, it's not just going one to n, but for each of the genes that are involved in the complex adaptation, they have to be sorted out and selected in the context of the other. So it takes a long time for adaptations to evolve, and therefore, again, our designs reflect a distillation of deep time. Okay, so now this is just a quick diagram, shocking diagram that is, don't take too seriously what functionally specific and functionally general mean, right? Because generality and specificity are, you could have that in different parts of the computational process. But anyway, just be intuitive and wild and loose like me, and say, okay, so you can take a hypothetical or presumably real program, evolved neural program, and you can locate it in here that some things are very simple and some things are very complex, but also some things are more specialized and some things are less specialized, right? And why create things like this? Well, early behaviorists, they thought things were very simple, and they had some specialized things in classical conditioning and so on, but then operant conditioning was more general. And then as the cognitive, well, they talked about generalization and so on, processes like that. And when cognitive revolution came along, or anthropological thinking, the idea is that humans have this general capacity for culture. And that wasn't necessarily a simple thing, but it was a general thing, right? So that, you know, so Marshall Solins described humans, their basic adaptation as an equipotential simple module, right? But whatever, so intelligence, rationality, these are not described in any computational precision, but the idea is that they're general. And so we call this blank slate kind of way of thinking. And so the point here is that, and on this basis, various theories of how social processes and cultural processes operated, right? So the point here is the history of how the theories that they considered as being representative of the human mind were in this blue area, right? And then there's this entire area of functionally specialized or partially functionally specialized and more complex things that really were not considered and weren't even conceptualized, right? And, but we would argue that social scientists ignored the possibility that there were, or were skeptical of the existence of evolved, complex, functionally specialized psychological mechanisms that are represented in this region of possible mechanism designs. And if you don't believe something exists, you will never look for them and you will never find them, right? So Chomsky was the person who first sort of said, well, there's something complicated, the ability to acquire grammar, and it requires a complex but somewhat specialized computational ability. And that was, in its time, which you can't remember, except Dan and a few of us, was treated as incredibly shocking and disturbing and undermining of good morality, as in addition to everything else, even though grammar seems pretty divorced from substantive claims about humans, which you might care about. But anyway, but But what if the mind is waiting for us to discover these things, and have we overlooked most of what you could call human nature? And if it's true that human nature is full of content-rich programs, then this requires radical changes to the foundations of the social sciences, right? So you have not blank slate learning, which explains most of what we are and do, but you have a bunch of different circuit logics for different pieces of circuitry or program architecture or whatever. And these are the building blocks out of which cultures, social interactions, and human systems of meaning are built, right? And so, and these could be things like kin detection, which I'm going to talk to today, and the whole suite of things involved in mating, mother-infant attachment with Bowlby, that was, again, an important thing. Face recognition, pretty specific. Prepared phobias. Anyway, lots of things that are specialized and different from the computational devices that govern other things, right? So anyway, so the exact location of things here is just notional. It's not meant to really be serious. Okay, so evolved programs arise in a design from which is full of. So as I mentioned, sort of Turing and the Bletchley Park people had to be prepared because they had an antagonist who didn't want to be predictable, who didn't want to be understood. They had to be prepared for all possible codes, right? And so that gave them an approach to computation, which is subtly but distinctly organized like that. And also there's an argument that AI depends upon general problem-solving ability. That's been searched for decades and decades and decades, and it's always 5 years off, right? But we would argue that a different approach to getting breadth is giving high, because we would argue that general problem-solving approaches are in general very weak because they have to subtract out anything which gives you high-quality information about this or that, a priori high-quality information about this or that region of problems that you might encounter, right? And so if you take away all of that, then what's left over is only things that might give you traction on all possible contents. And the more you seriously study that, the more you realize that that's incredibly hard to achieve, right? So the way you get breadth is not by taking away specificity. That's the anthropological theory of how humans evolved, that maybe we had instincts in the past like other animals, but they were erased over the course of evolution, and instead we got this blank slate, generally intelligent, whatever, okay? So AI that bundles together a bunch of specializations gives you more and more breadth, would be how we would suggest it. There's another critical step here, which I could spend an hour on, but so Shannon's information theory, a key element of that is if you have a sender and a receiver, in order for the receiver to understand the signals being sent, they have to share a code, right? And how can these shared codes be established? Well, natural selection gives both sender and receiver, for humans, the same. So children could not learn their language, assign meanings to utterances. If those utterances could literally mean anything, right, then it would take an infinite amount of information. So it's parallel to Chomsky's argument about grammar, but you have the exact same argument, even more forcefully applied to there being some constraints on the meaning, some prior probabilities that a young child hearing language and seeing a situation can assign likely meanings, not perfect every time, but something that allows her or him to bootstrap, right? And also you can think that learning is a similar kind of thing, that there's a sender, which is just the universe with structure, and you can treat some of those things as cues to what's going on, right? And natural selection will shape something like a receiver, right, that assigns probable meanings to the cues about what really is happening in the universe, right? And so learning systems also have to depend upon these Bayesian priors, right? If you want to put it that way. So, and also there's all sorts of questions in human life, sort of mind reading, cultural comprehensibility, and the convergence of communicators on what's mutually manifest so they can interpret each other's utterances. All these things depend upon having a shared set of, not a completely shared with no open variables, but an overlapping set of meaning assignments. Okay. So let's take an example, which is, okay, that went on too long. Okay, so this is work with our student, the brilliant Deb Lieberman, and you can get the details in Nature, but ancestrally, there was intense selection on our ancestors to avoid mating with close genetic relatives because it creates genetically damaged offspring, and that's bad, and they are selected against, and compared to those who would avoid mating with close genetic relatives. And also, there's this entirely separate selection pressure. So we have two very different adaptive problems to care for and aid close genetic relatives according to the trade-offs that are implicit in the structure of Mendelian genetics, and this is analyzed most famously by Bill Hamilton, but preceded by George Williams, and also then paralleled by, or independent insight by John Maynard Smith. And so kin selection is the concept, and so these are two very different adaptive problems, but they depend on knowing the same information, which is who is a genetic relative. You can't avoid mating with a genetic relative if you don't know who they are, right? And you can't differentially feel inclined to assist or avoid hurting a close genetic relative if you don't know who they are. So in one sense, the first part, the front end of this system, has to look for the same kind of information. It's the same adaptive problem from the front end, even though the outputs are very different adaptive problems, right? And so you can look at the causal and statistical structure of the ancestral world, and that should allow you to form some hypotheses, better than random, one hopes, about what the cues for detection of genetic relatives should be. First of all, it tells you there should be a system like this. Secondly, it gives you a number of suggestions about what to look for. And that's things in the ancestral environment that would carry the information, be predictors of genetic relatedness. Okay, so you need a human kin detection system that's well engineered given the structure of ancestral environments, so the mesh between the design and the mind, and the long-term structure of the world. So you need a cue registration system, something that is designed to pick out the right cues and monitor for those cues. And then you need something that takes those cues and transforms them into the information format you want, which is, we call it a kinship index. It's the mind's estimate of who is closely and who is more distantly genetically related. And so for each familiar individual that you encounter, the brain should assign, based on the cues available to it, a kinship index, right? And we know that general learning can't be the solution, because how does general learning get it would need to know the information that it's trying to induce, right? And it doesn't know. So something has to provide the original source of information. And that's the specialization that's sifted for all the different cues that might have been present, that were present in the ancestral environment, which ones were in fact informative about this adaptive problem, right? And so words like mother or brother, those are around for a few tens of generations, and then they go away, right? So it can't be something like that. It has to be something that's there generation after generation after generation after generation in widely different cultures, in widely different places, right? Okay, so people often say 10 minutes. Okay, that's a nightmare. I'm going to pretend I didn't see that. Okay, 15 minutes. Okay, great. Okay, so we know, so often people say, you can't possibly know the past, right? And so isn't this just a speculative concoction that you're smoking or taking mushrooms and you come up with an explanation and that's the quality of the science you do? Well, the first thing to say is they haven't thought seriously about the fact that there are many things about the past that we know nothing about or very little about. And so you don't use those to look, right? You don't look for things. You look for things where you have some confidence that you know something informative about it. And if you start to list those things, there's hundreds or thousands of things, depending on how you count, of the past that you know with certainty or with very high confidence. So all the laws of physics were there, gravity was still there. So if you want to look at fear of falling, gravity was a thing. And you could say, well, we don't know there was gravity, 500,000 years ago, but okay. I put you in a separate category and I treat you gently, right? So chemistry, all sorts of features of biology. You can study primates and foragers and see sort of enduring features. We know the world was three-dimensional. We know that mammalian reproduction had certain properties, and on and on. Okay, so and we know in this case will be important that if something comes out of a woman's body, a life form comes out of a woman's body, that's her genetic relative, that's her offspring, right? And you know that with pretty high certainty. Okay, so the accusation of just so post hoc storytelling it is however admirably brilliant. I really admire the intelligence of this criticism because it falsely implies that adaptation analysis is post hoc and not hypothesis testing of prior predictions, right? But in reality, it can't possibly be post hoc if it's used to predict and detect new, never before observed features of the human architecture. And even when you start with something that you are wondering about and you observe, by the time you're done with an adaptationist analysis, there's all sorts of new features that you predict and understand. Okay, so mapping the architecture is an entirely different goal than explaining known phenomena by reference to the past. You use the past as a guide to present research, right? And if you make a mistake about characterizing the past, and all that does is it throws you back in what people do now, which is to be a blind empirical. You're just as likely, if you have a false hypothesis about the past, to stumble over something interesting as if you're just randomly, experimentally testing, right? So, okay. And also, the just so story accusation is brilliant, but also unscientific because it's true in some basic sense that if you just substitute the word explanation for just so story, all science deals in explanations. And so it just makes the insinuation that you have a bad explanation without requiring the person who's making that accusation to do any analytic work or testing work themselves to show that your argument is bad. It's just, I, from my superior position, declare it to be a bad argument, which is not how science proceeds. So, so it's a pretty clever thing. But back to our plot. What cues should the human system use? And they naturally emerge from analyzing hunter-gatherer life. The first thing we thought would be a very high-quality cue is, as I said, if somebody comes out of your mother's body, then that's her child. And if you have, in fact, a kin recognition system that says, this is my mother, and this came out of her body, right? Then I have a recognition system for a sibling, right there. And it's a high-quality system. The information quality is very high, okay? So we call that maternal perinatal association. You might not be right there when the birth happens, but mothers take care of their infants ancestrally with more than anybody else, right? And so that's a mammalian feature. And even in our modern data measurement of modern people, which could be very different because of technology and so on, still it's a very high quality cue. Maternal perinatal association is, correlates with relatedness at a very high degree, right? Okay, but this only works for if you're an older sibling and you watch this, then you get that information. If you're a younger sibling, you don't exist when your older sibling is getting intense maternal care. And your older sibling, by the time you're born, is running around the landscape, right? So you need something else aside from, and so a second cue is childhood co-residence, which Westermarck talked about familiarity in childhood breeding sexual disinterest. And he was a brilliant Finnish Darwinian sociologist. And Darwin, really, he was discredited by Freud, who couldn't possibly have it the case that people were designed to resist incest, right? Because his whole system was based on the relevant mystery of the reverse, right? But anyway, but we thought if you analyze it a little bit more selectively, so the idea from Westermarck is turned into with human ethologists as early imprinting period, first 2, 3, 4 years, okay, and you're imprinted. But in fact, you get information from the ecology. For a forager, children tend to stay with parents up until the time when they sort of start independent reproductive careers of their own. And so sometime between, 16 and, 18 or 19, they start to independent orbit. But prior to that, with the fusion-fission system of foraging, when things are abundant, people can forage together. When things are less abundant, then bands break up. And so if there's a device in the brain that says, am I with you now? Am I with you now? Am I with you now? And sums that up from 0 to 17, 16, 18. We can't exactly tell from our data, but that is our guess. Then that will give you a cue, not as good as coming out of the mother's body or being taken care of, but as next best cue. Okay. And then, so we quantitatively measured exposure to potential cues of relatedness and tested for matches in the measured variation in sibling altruism and sibling incest aversion, and also moral objections. And you expect that the two cues will require some integration. Okay, how are the cues combined to produce a kinship estimator? So there needs to be a computational step there. And so we expected or suspect they might be non-compensatory, because if you have Gigerenzer and others have shown that if you have a good cue and a less good cue, combining them often gives you counterintuitively less good guidance than if you just use the best cue, right? And so we conjectured that the system might be designed to, if you have access to maternal perinatal association, you just use that. And if you don't have that, then you fall back on a less reliable cue, but the only one, one that you have, which is co-residence. Okay, so this is Deb Lieberman, her mother, and her younger sister, and that would be observing maternal perinatal care. Older siblings indeed use MPA and not co-residence. So even though we have co-residence data on them, that predicts nothing about their disgust level about sexual contact or their willingness to, their disposition to be altruistic, okay? And this is a cue that's available everywhere, right? And so why go to the bother of detecting all these cues? So then you have a theory about what the outputs, the calibrated outputs should be. So the Kinship Index evolved to regulate the motivational system causing or interfering with sexual attraction, and the motivational system causing or inclining one to help or care for others. Okay, so high Kinship Index downregulates sexual attraction, but it upregulates motivation to help, right? And okay, so so we have these 5 different measures, and you could imagine the altruism system works on one set of inputs and the disgust system works on a separate set of inputs because they're separate systems, right? But they need the same information. And so we can tell that they march in more or less lockstep in the same individual. And also we used, there is no logical step that says you should object to in third parties things that you don't want to do yourself. So you might object to adultery in others and want to commit adultery yourself, for example. It's not a foregone conclusion. But the claim was that there's a relationship between your feeling about incest for yourself and the degree to which you disapprove of it in others. We had an unobtrusive measure of people's moral objections and put in there. So, you know, how bad is smoking marijuana? How bad is speeding? How bad is murder? How bad is theft? How bad is sleeping with your father? How bad is marrying your sister? You know, all this in a big long list, and these things would go up and down relative to each other, depending upon the registration of cues by the individual answering the instrument, right? And so we find here that the where a maternal perinatal cue is absent, then co-residence predicts. Okay, invisible to me, but anyway, on the left. And on the right, everything, when the maternal perinatal association is present, co-residence isn't used by the individual. So if you saw your sibling being taken care of by your mother, you will take care of them, or you'll be disgusted by the prospect of sex with them, just by having seen that, even if you leave the household at age 5 and go somewhere else and have no co-residence with the baby after that. It's the same level, right? Not co-residence doesn't adjust it up or down, right? And on the other hand, if you don't see your mother doing that, then you slowly, over the course of your life, co-residing with the other person, develop stronger and stronger and stronger sexual aversion and willingness to care for the person, right? Okay, so this is a crude napkin drawing of what we think the system looks like. Everything with blacked in arrows are things we have evidence for. So co-residence, maternal and perinatal, we don't know that there are no other signals, but there's not a lot of room for them. There's some room, so there could be other things. So we tested for a lot of things we thought would be obvious. We wanted to break down co-residence into something more specific, and we tested, but co-residence, there was nothing left over when we had the co-residence measure. And so the kinship measure takes these systems that have registered quantitative information about these things and then turns it into a kinship index. And then the kinship index feeds into the trade-offs you are willing to make for this other person, motivations involving guiding what you might call altruistic behavior or anyway. And then there's another completely separate system, right? So a high kinship index downregulates the sexual value, how sexually attractive or aversive you find this person, right? And so that's a little piece of, so we have this graph of all these things up there, and so the idea is that there are lots and lots of things like this, and then there's lots of, what do you get with a cybernetic approach that's absent in orthodox approaches? First, you get evolutionary biology suggests there are these adaptive problems, and there are often contentful theories in evolutionary biology about this or that domain, and what successful behavior or performance with respect to that domain is, right? And you don't just get this from common sense. So, so you get an adaptive problem. In this case, we have 2 different adaptive problems, which is even more interesting. And that suggests that you go look for neural programs that nobody ever really thought to look for before. That's a slight exaggeration with respect to incest avoidance, but anyway. And you get the goal of the computation. What does the system functional product look like? So regulation of these 2 types of behavior. And what does the system need to compute to arrive at the solution? Something like a kinship index. And you get a task environment with recurrent structure, which is forager life, which comes with an information ecology, and you don't know this perfectly, but you can make educated guesses about it, and then that's a role. I mean, obviously you need to empirically test everything because reasoning can often go awry in all sorts of surprising ways, but still there's a heavy a priori theoretical part of this which helps to, it's like getting an aerial map of the human mind from above, and then you have to land and sort of do more precise surveying down on the ground, right? But it's a huge advantage to just landing on the shore of an empty continent and wandering around, right? And then together, these could be used to formulate candidate hypotheses about the designs for the corresponding evolved problem-solving programs in the head. And then you can then design empirical tests, so Einstein says it's the theory which determines what you can observe, right? So nobody would think to look for these things, and you wouldn't find them in millennia if you're just randomly looking, right? And then each theory of selection pressures generates the starting point for discovering new, previously unknown programs. We have just a big pool, so another hour? Okay, got it, okay. And then I just want to emphasize that this is a kin detection system. It's a learning system, right? It's learning information about the world, right? And we think learning systems are equipotential and blank slate, but the snake phobia system, it's a learning system. All these systems are learning systems, but if you say something occurs by learning, all that is to say is something about the environment interaction with the organism calibrates the organism to perform better with respect to that environment, right? And it doesn't say there's nothing evolved there. In fact, you can't really design a learning system that's really going to be plausible unless it has a lot of pre-existing structure knowing or meshing with the actual structure of the real world. And then one final thing is that there is content and things that we would think are contentful in these systems. And we don't have really any very good idea of the exact form of these things, right? So all this stuff is really at the beginning, right? So ground floor, you guys can rush in. And anyway, but something like, so there's specializations for mother. So Harry Harlow's work, that mother is not just the system which gives you milk, okay? That the infant has a pre-existing model, right? Okay, but here, mother is a kind of computational element that is tagged, and it's used for various purposes, including kin detection, right? And then it's also part in the mother-infant attached system. So we arrive in the world, and we have perceptual systems which populate our contingent representations of what's around us. So there's this person, and there's that animal, and so on. But for us to be guided, we have all this machinery which is there to harness us to do replicative work with respect to the contingent aspects of the world, right? So there has to be a coupling or recognition of the ontology of the contingent things in the world. So here, this is a system which is attaching, motivational and I would argue also categorical things to this particular person. This is my sister, this is my brother, this is my mother, right? So there's this innate concept, reliably developing evolved concept, mother, and a reliably developing evolved concept, sibling, and reliably developing evolved concept, snake. And so we recognize something snake-like, and then that gives us a situation representation that where our evolved system to what to do with respect to snakes give us a spatial representation with a motivational gradient. Stay away from, and to make trade-offs. So stay away from the snake unless your child is right next to the snake, in which case run towards the snake. So there has to be prioritization gradients which carve up, and then I have a whole lecture on anger, but which I'm sure you'll be happy to stay here, okay. And I would say that we talk about a lot of these things in the head as internal regulatory variables, and they do not correspond to our folk psychology of beliefs and desires. So anthropology is the formalization of belief-desire psychology, so is economics. But there's lots of things which do not correspond to that in the head. There's this whole system, and I will turn off the tap now.
Thank you very much.